Hello, Alan.
Michael
Nice to meet you.
It's a great pleasure to meet
Same
you.
here. Come on in.
I was born in Hollywood, California, and my wife often says, please don't tell people that, it destroys your credibility. But I loved growing up in Southern California in those early days in the 30s and 40s because it was a very different place than today. I think I gained a lot from the fact that it was a very eclectic community and one in which ideas could soar in the sense of not being restricted by religious conventions or anything really that would inhibit someone who was a free spirit, as I was, to explore ideas. And it was a community, of course, and it is today, of entertainment, of storytelling. And I think that fostered my imagination because, after all, this was a movie town and movies are stories. I must say this, though, that during those early years as I grew up, I was always searching. I always knew that there was something important that I had to do. I didn't know what it was, but I had a sense that it had to do with the human spirit. I went to a very strict prep school in high school, a place called Harvard in Los Angeles that was an Episcopal school, and I soon learned that I had little or no use for organized religion. Naturally, being a young man, I was very rebellious. I value very much people who have religious beliefs because I feel that it sustains them in life. So I'm very respectful of people's religious convictions. What I don't like is the kind of fundamentalism that I see today, which is based, I think, on superstition, fear, dogma, where you have a rigid set of principles, rules, whatever, that governs life that kind of takes away from the free spirit of people. So it is the extremes that I worry about. And you might ask, well, then if you're not a religious person, are you spiritual? And I hope I am, and I hope that my clients have brought me to that place. Thank God for them, because truthfully, when I began my work, I was an atheist. Today, I hope I'm more of a spiritual person. I'm not a religious person, but I hope I'm spiritual. So, growing up in that community, I think fostered a lot of my inquiry about life. I've done a lot of traveling around the world, and I feel that it has taken me a long time to come to the place where I am today. It's been a slow evolution of intellectual thinking in terms of who we are, why we are here. I did a lot of searching throughout the world to try to discover these basic ideas that mankind has thought so much about over our many centuries of inquiry into the reasons for life. Now, one of the things I think I probably should tell you, Alan, is that I came, despite all that I've told you, from a very, as far as academics, a traditional background. I was a counseling psychologist, and eventually I specialized in the use of hypnotherapy in my practice. And it would be fair to say, I think, that I came kicking and screaming into the New Age movement, because I started way back in the middle 50s at the time of the famous Bridey Murphy case in 1956. That was my first year really of practice. And this was a sensational case about past lives. People would call me and say, Michael, we understand that you use hypnotherapy in your practice. Could you help me explore my own past lives? And I was rather imperious in those days. I would say, well, that's all very well, but you know, and I am interested in what I read about past life regression, but that's not me. That's not what I do. I'm a very traditional psychotherapist. I work with childhood trauma issues, both emotional and physical, in which I use hypnotherapy. But no, I don't do past life regression. So it was a long time before I was introduced to past life, kind of inadvertently. What happened to me was that I had this man who called early on in my years of practice and said to me, he did not ask for a past life regression. He simply said to me, I wonder if you could deprogram an injury that I think I sustained in childhood. That still bothers me and it's getting worse and I'm not sleeping well. And I asked if he'd been to medical doctors about this. Oh yes, many x-rays. They consider my case as one where I simply psychologically have built up something that doesn't exist in terms of a medical problem. And I really need your help. So naturally I took this gentleman and I asked him where his pain was, and he explained it was in the side, always in the same place under the ribs, lower down on his left side. And so I took him into his childhood. We worked for a while in his childhood and got nowhere. He simply, I thought maybe he'd fallen on a kitchen knife, for example, at a young age. Nothing came out at all. So finally, in frustration, I said to him, I want you to go to the source of your pain. When was the first time that you felt this pain? Now, I need to tell you that this man was very somnambulistic. He went very deep, very quickly into hypnosis. In fact, he was ahead of me. And what had happened is that he had gone into a deeper alpha state, in what we call an upper alpha state, rather than a middle or more shallow alpha state, which is where I typically work with childhood trauma. So, suddenly, he's screaming. And I'm wondering, what's going on here? And he said, I'm being bayoneted. And I said, where are you? Now, being a historian, it didn't take me long to realize when he mentioned the Somme that we were in World War I, and that this man was at the First Battle of the Somme. It was July 1st, 1916, and if I'm not mistaken, there were about 20,000 men killed that day. He was a British sergeant in the 4th Corps. I checked all this out later, incidentally, but at the time I just couldn't believe this was happening to me. And he explained that he was dying in the mud from a bayonet wound. Now, a kind person, a true psychotherapist, would have been trying to help this poor man get through this. But I didn't believe what was happening. So I wanted to know his name, rank, and serial number. I wanted to know if he would turn and look at the patch on his uniform and tell me what division he was in. These kinds of things. As a researcher, I looked to this first rather than trying to help this poor fellow. And I'm ashamed of this today, but this is what actually happened. So finally, I took pity on him after I got an awful lot of information. And we discerned exactly what was happening to him and why, and then I deprogrammed his injury, pulled him out of it, pulled him above it, and he became very quiet. So after that, I awakened him, we talked about what had happened, and he said he felt wonderfully refreshed. I was glad because I didn't feel refreshed. I didn't feel I'd done my job. But apparently it was all he needed. And he went back home. He called me 2 or 3 days later and he said, my wife wants to thank you. I'm now sleeping at night so she too can sleep. And so from that case, I realized that I needed to probably get with the program and find out what's going on here spiritually and so forth. Now, mind you, this did not prevent me from checking with the British War Office and the Imperial Museum in London. And I found out the facts of this case, that there really truly was such a person, and he did exist in this particular division and unit at the time, and he described the battle perfectly. So from that case, I began to start accepting past life clients. A little bit at a time, mind you. I was still doing a lot of traditional work. It wasn't an awfully long time after that when I had my second case. And I mentioned this background to you, Alan, because I think it's important for you to understand where I'm coming from as far as how I've arrived at where I am today. A woman came to me with feelings of isolation. She was very disturbed. I thought this was typical case of someone who was depressed. She felt none of her friends were around her. She felt lonely. She felt disconnected from society. Okay. So I took her first into her childhood. We talked about childhood friends. There were not many. And apparently they did not relate to the people she was looking for. So then I moved her into a past life. Now once again, I need to tell you that this lady was very somnambulistic. She went very deep, very fast. And she too was getting a little ahead of me. Only the difference between this case and the World War I soldier was that she'd gone even deeper into what we call the theta state. She was in a superconscious state. I asked her to, once again in frustration, when we did not have any results from her past life, where she saw a few friends, but not the people she was looking for, go to the place and time when you last saw your group of friends that you're missing. This was the key. This unlocked the door for me, because the word group is a trigger word, because we have spiritual groups. Suddenly, she was in the spirit world. I, of course, did not know there was such a thing. Most people who work in past life regression think that there's nothing more than a grayish limbo between lives. And of course, today I know this is not true. In this woman's case, she began to cry. She was laughing for joy and crying at the same time with her eyes closed, pointing to my office wall. There they all are. And I said, where are we? I thought we jumped into another life. I didn't know where we were. Oh, she said, I'm in the spirit world. These are my soulmates. These are my spiritual friends. And I'm thinking, oh my God, why me? I mean, you couldn't pick a more inappropriate person than myself for this kind of analysis. I was not that metaphysical. I truly wasn't. I did my best, as I had done with a man in World War I, and I found out a little bit about this soul group and discovered that she truly was between lives. And I just want to tell you that from these two cases, I began to realize there was much more of the world that I didn't know of, and that in fact I had been given with this tremendous gift to be given a key to learn the things that I wanted to learn all my life up to that time. Who are we? Why are we here? Who sent us? And where are we going? So from that case, I worked for years kind of by myself, Ellen. I did not go to metaphysical conventions. I did not go to hypnosis conventions. People later, my colleagues, told me this was quite, unfair for you to leave us out of your research. And of course, I didn't want them involved with my research. I felt I had to do it alone. I didn't want to be biased by their opinions. I wanted to work on my own cases, and I worked on thousands of cases all through the 70s and 80s. Other works began to come out indicating that there was something more to just past life regression. There was this other area, perhaps. Finally, when I had pretty close to about 7,000 cases and boxes of notes, I really retired from Los Angeles, where my practice had been, and moved up to where I am today in Northern California in the Sierra foothills. Began to write my first book, which was published in 1994, and I'll show it to you. It was called Journey of Souls. And Journey of Souls was my first book to indicate to the public what it is like to cross over, what it is like to die and cross over, who comes to meet us, where do we go. It was really an eye-opener, because Journey of Souls was intended to be kind of like an overview, sort of like a play, if you will, as a soul passes through the spirit world and what they do there and how they return and how they choose their bodies. It was an overview, but by no means did it give anywhere near the detail that I'd collected from those cases. So a number of years went by. Let's see, that book was published, Journey of Souls was published in '94. And in 2001, my second book was published, and during the interim period of time, this book, Destiny of Souls, was a lot more detail that I had not brought out. People on the lecture circuit would tell me, Michael, we know that you know more. You're not telling us. One of the things they wanted to know was how people who we love very much, who have crossed over, come back and touch us. In chapter 2 of this book, I describe how spirits come back, reach back and come to touch us in various ways, whether it be through small children, through flowers, through clothes, through connecting with the individual themselves. So I explained that. Now, the third book and my last book is Life Between Lives. The reason I wrote this book was because for a long time I fought with the idea of giving a map, so to speak, of how I had unlocked a lot of the information that I had about the spirit world. Now, Life Between Lives is really a book designed to do two things. It came out a few years after my second book, I think around 2004. The book had a purpose of teaching other hypnotherapists how to access the information I had on helping people reach their in-between life state. I mean, for decades we'd had books on past lives, but there was no book like this. So that's partly the reason I wrote it. And the other reason I wrote it was because I wanted people to see what the process was like. I didn't want them to be fearful of it. And I thought if they understood and knew how a therapist can take people in hypnosis, very, very deep in hypnosis, into a life between life state, they would be less nervous about wanting the procedure themselves. I also hoped that a lot of people who were using my first two books inappropriately and not doing the correct things in my view, that this book would be kind of like a textbook for hypnotherapists to help them in that regard. And I'd like to also say, Alan, that I decided in 2001 to form my own organization where I could train hypnotherapists and train others to help me do this. And I did that in 2001. And so today I have an active organization of people who are doing this sort of work. It's kind of a long-winded answer to your very basic questions of how did I come to the place I am today, but that's kind of the scenario.
Well, that's brilliant. You've answered about 10 questions there, I think, and I was thinking, this is going to be a Q&A, but, this is absolutely fine. Marvelous amounts of information. A question I have for you, is about the actual nature of hypnosis. I think probably most people's experience of hypnosis is stage hypnotists and what they read in popular magazines. And probably there's a bit of fear about the nature of hypnosis. Could you just describe, first of all, scientifically and psychologically, what's happening when people are hypnotized? And then the second question really is about, are they open to suggestion, or do we still have control?
Firstly, let me explain that how strict a position you want to take as to the validity of hypnosis depends on your willingness to accept self-reports as data. Because there is no, quote, scientific way to describe hypnosis any more than there is a scientific way to describe many aspects of psychology and other disciplines. Hypnosis has been around for a long time. It was only recognized by the AMA in America in 1958 as an appropriate therapy tool, which I think was rather late in the game, but nonetheless it is recognized today as a very appropriate therapy tool in many, many cases. Now, people who are in deep hypnosis are giving you information that is coming from their mind that they feel is true. It may not be always literally true as far as their everyday activities. And people who work in hypnosis in childhood issues understand this, but they believe it to be true. And working with a client long enough, you can usually unravel the difference between the two. Now, you have to remember that with thousands of cases, I had a tremendous consistency of information. What one client might be a little hazy about, another would explain. So eventually all of this mesh, this huge complicated jigsaw puzzle of mapping, so to speak, the experiences of people after they die, what happens to them. I, of course, feel that hypnosis is a wonderful, valid tool to gain this information, far more than other modalities that I've heard about, such as channeling and so forth, taking nothing away from these other aspects. But I, of course, am very biased in favor of hypnosis because I know its power, and I know what people are capable of remembering in hypnosis. Now, getting back to your original question, Alan, it's important to understand that a facilitator not program his or her client. You ask questions like, what do you see? Not, do you see so-and-so? This is so important when you're working in this kind of area. It isn't nearly as important in past life regression. I mean, we can find out that there was, you were in a body of a Civil War soldier, for instance, who died on a battlefield in 1864, and pretty much get the nuts and bolts of what happened and so forth, very similar to what I got with the World War I soldier. But when you're getting into an ethereal field, like being in a disembodied soul state, those memories have to be very carefully analyzed. Questions have to be phrased in such a way as to not influence the client, but allow the client to develop their own memories in their own way, even though you may be using a format to get them from place to place. This is what my third book, Life Between Lives, is all about. I work very hard in training facilitators to do just what I've described, and do not bring their own biases and prejudices and belief systems into a Life Between Lives session. This is very important. Now, the other aspects of the mechanics of hypnosis, Alan, I'll just briefly explain that in my view, I think a lot of us who meditate every day are in a shallow alpha state. Okay. When we work with people in, say, a childhood, uncovering childhood memories where there has been perhaps great trauma, I would guess in most cases we're working in a shallow to medium alpha state. When we work in past life regression, we work in what is called an upper alpha state, pretty generally, and these are generalizations. It's not something you can nail down, and again, it's awfully hard to measure scientifically what I'm talking about. It basically comes from experience. However, in working with Life Between Lives, and I think this is what trips up so many people who like to get involved with this, we need to go one stage deeper, to the theta state. Now, these are normal states of altered consciousness. Every morning when we wake up, we come from a deep sleep, delta state, up into theta, and then we get into alpha, and finally we come into a full wake state. And you do just the reverse when you go to bed at night. So these are not unnatural. It's just that if we went any deeper than the theta state, we'd have a client who was asleep and couldn't answer questions. So the mind is still conscious. The conscious mind is still active, or otherwise we would not be able to get the information that we get. So learning how to do this, to work in this kind of a deep hypnosis state in order to access this information, is something that I think needs to be taught to practicing hypnotherapists. And you know, our organization has worked a lot with people from all different backgrounds and experience in this regard. And I can tell you that the thing that shocks them the most when there are new students and just starting to work with Life Between Lives is the length of time that it takes to work with a client. I mean, most people who are counselors in one form or another have what we call the 45-minute client session, or perhaps an hour. In order to get the kind of information that is necessary for a true life between life experience, takes from 3 to 4 hours. It's hard work. It's hard on you, it's hard on your client. And you need to learn the hypnosis techniques necessary in order to take people that deep and to sustain that. That's why our training takes a week's length of time. And I have a number of people that I've trained who are my teachers and facilitators, and they do a wonderful job in helping new students. I say students, but the people who come to us are professionals who've been around a long time. We don't take beginner type hypnosis people. So it's, again, a long-winded way of answering your question about the hypnosis and the validity of it. There are people who will never accept hypnosis as a form or technique to be used in order to access information. And with that kind of belief system, of course, I can't really work with people who have that kind of feeling. Now, taking it from another side, what about the person who comes to you that doesn't believe in hypnosis but still wants to know about what their soul state is like? Very oftentimes these people can be hypnotized very quickly and taken very deeply. The fact that you don't necessarily believe it does not seem to matter in many cases. What does matter is the person who's in a fully conscious state who would never come for life between life regression because they don't think hypnosis is appropriate. Then, of course, we have the fundamentalist wing who believe that religious people who feel very strongly that hypnosis is the work of the devil. So, we go with what we have, Alan.
Okay, great. Okay, that's good. You okay?
Spot on. Beautiful.
Getting a bird out there, but no, this is all part of the thing. What is required to become an LBL therapist? Are there any special qualities? Can anyone train?
Let me tell you that this is a very good question. We get many requests from people around the world to become students, and we only offer classes once or twice a year. The organization I founded back in 2001 was called the Society of Spiritual Regression. That name has now been changed, and really quite an honor for me, to the Newton Institute. And I really voted against it, but I was outvoted. I felt it was too self-serving, but my, quote, disciples said, no, we're going to call it the Michael Newton Institute, whether you like it or not. So anyway, it is the Newton Institute, and what we do is we have a board of people who analyze student applications. We require a few basic things. Number one, we want them to have hopefully been working in the field at least 3 years. We would like to see a lot of past life cases. We would like to see at least 300 hours of formal hypnosis academic training from a recognized school. So there are a lot of different things we look at. We look at the temperament. We try to look at the temperament and the motivations of the people who apply to us. We don't stress the fact that they have to have all sorts of academic degrees, because frankly, very oftentimes that person may not be the best hypnotherapist. And on the other hand, we have hypnotherapists who've had very little academic training but are just naturally talented and brilliant at working with people in hypnosis. It's a combination of things. I think a grounding in psychology is very helpful in our field. I just want to say that. I think it's very important. Now, when they come to us, usually our classes are anywhere from, let's say, 25 to 50. We don't like to take over 40 students. And so I would say an average class about 30, 35 students, and they spend a week with us. We have lectures, and then we have films, and then they practice on each other under the supervision of a trainer. So I think it's a very good program, but I do want you to know that we do analyze people pretty carefully who apply to come to us. We make mistakes, like anybody would, but I think on the whole we have had some very, very good students, and they're very active today in the field.
What would you say, apart from the rigorous training, what special personal quality do you think a really great LBL should have? Is it a particular type of sensitivity, or is it the ability to sort of almost empathically tune in to their client and their state of consciousness?
All those things, Alan. First of all, curiosity. What drove me all those years in the early stages when there was no one else around doing this kind of work, no one to talk to about it, was an abiding curiosity for this wonderful place where souls are created and developed and join human bodies. I couldn't let it go. I finally closed my practice to all other aspects except people who wanted to come and access their lives. We look for people who have a code of ethics about their behavior. It's awfully hard to determine that in applications and even in personal interviews. But we want people who are very, very ethical about the way they treat their clients. People often ask me, well, do you have to be a metaphysical person, an astrologer, or a tarot card reader? And I've often been criticized for this. But frankly, I'd rather not have them not have that kind of metaphysical background. I like people to come to work with us who are hypnotherapists in their own right, and this is where they work, and this is their field of specialty. So it's a combination of a lot of things. It's awfully hard to measure talent, Alan, before you have somebody that you're working with right in front of you. But I think commitment is really important to what we do. We have to have people that are not wanting to use this as a lark. Financial gain, this troubles me a great deal, that there are people out there, even in our field, who seem to be more concerned with financial gain than with really, I consider the basics of wanting to work in this field, which is being a searcher, which is a sensitivity and wanting to really help clients and to make their lives better. And I think it's a commitment that we're looking for to helping the world, if you will, through making people more cognizant of who they are and why they're here. And there's an awful lot of lost souls out there, a lot of people who are very fearful about life in many respects, and these are the people we want to help.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just pause?
I want to bring the sort of biographical questions and the questions about your work in a fairly general way. I want to bring these to a conclusion here, but in a very personal way. And this is my question. And you have mentioned this somewhat already, and you're saying that you felt even as a boy and a young man, you did feel that you had some quest. There was you wanted to find out about spirit, but this is really, I am addressing your higher self here, this question. Looking back, can you see a direct path to your life's work running way back into your teens and even childhood? Were the seeds of this path present early on? And were there any key experiences that foreshadowed what was to come?
Well, I had a near-death experience when I was very young. I was sent off to boarding school by a British mother who believed that's the way to bring up children. Being a kind of abandoned child does a lot of things to a young child. And they learn to either fend for themselves and acquire a great deal of discipline, or they become marshmallows. And they have a very tough time the rest of their life with coping, because their identity has been kind of taken from them because they feel a lack of parental love. And I didn't have a lack of parental love, but it was disengagement. It was just this child needs to be brought up by others. And I'm not saying I wasn't a difficult child. I was always into things and inquiring about things. But I need to say that my past life kind of flew in front of me when I jumped into the middle of a swimming pool, large swimming pool, when I didn't know how to swim. I think I was 5. And as I was going down, a lot of things were coming into my mind. And then somebody saw me. It was a crowded Sunday. I was very lucky. Somebody jumped in and pulled me out. Those are the days before lifeguards. Now, that showed me, because I felt like I was almost out of my body. You could argue that perhaps a child who's going through that is already disengaging. and is moving into a spiritual state, because I was drowning. And so I think that you could say perhaps that's where it began, my feeling that this body was temporary, and that there were other things that I didn't understand that could not be seen, because I was seeing things. I began, after that experience, to kind of self-meditate. This was before there were books on meditation and teachers to teach you how to meditate. I sort of began to meditate and dream and think. And I created imaginary worlds for myself where I could kind of get out of my body and look back at all this. I say this just as a prelude to telling you that as time went on, I was not satisfied with the world as a beginning and end. Our world, Earth. I just knew there was something more and that I needed to search for it. And so in the years that followed, I studied a lot of philosophy and psychology and history, archaeology, did a lot of traveling as I got older, always searching. I spent time in a Buddhist monastery in northern Thailand. But I knew I was close to it, but I hadn't felt I had really discovered what I really wanted to discover. So here I was I mentioned, brought kicking and screaming to the New Age movement. It wasn't until, however, that I had that lady who I described was so lonely and told me about her life in the spirit world, that the aha came over me. And I thought, this is it. This is what I've been waiting all my life for. And when you think about the preparation, I mean, how curious that I happened to be someone who studied psychology and counseling, that I got interested in hypnotherapy, that I understood enough about history and the way of things in the past to be able to put things together in terms of what I was discovering about the human condition, not only in past lives, but life between lives in a sense, because it is a classroom in the sky up there. And I became, for a while I was teaching a college at night, became a night college teacher, so I understood what it was like to be a teacher, and I was hearing stories of how souls between their lives were being taught. So I integrated with all this. In fact, the word integration is curious because although I initially called our association the Society for Spiritual Regression, it's really spiritual integration that we do. Regression is a hypnosis word. You regress people into the past, but it doesn't apply really so much to life between lives. That's a here and now situation. And we often talk about now time in the spirit world, where there is no past, present, or future. It's all in one frame. It's now time. So that too was something that I had to learn. So I think from a biography standpoint, a lot of things led me to the place where I was ready finally to have the door opened a little bit for me and to see what lay beyond.
And do you think now, with the knowledge that you have of other people's spiritual agreements or plans, that you actually deliberately chose to jump in that pool to get that experience?
Now of course, I realize that it was by design. I don't believe in fate. I think we have free will. I took many wrong turns till I got back on track. But now that I look back on it all and see the forks of the road that I chose to take, I often have asked my wife, Peggy, why did it take so long? I mean, I didn't really get rolling until I was in my 60s as far as informing the public about my work, to begin to teach, to travel around the country as I did for 10 years and write the books. She said, you weren't ready. It was too early. And yet it seemed to take me an awful long time to take wrong turns and get back on track until I finally came to the point of discovery. And now that I look back on it, I think she's right. It did take me many, many years to have the understanding, and I think in order to make the discoveries that I did. And I was tenacious. I was like a courtroom prosecutor. When I had someone in deep hypnosis describing the spirit world, I have very gentle people that I train as facilitators. And I'm a very directive person, and although I don't lead the client, I do my best to avoid that. I want information because I know they want information. I make them work hard, which is something we haven't discussed, Alan, but people don't voluntarily give information that easily. This is a very sacred place. You have to work at it to get them to open up, and they have to understand that you know your way around the spirit world. They have to have confidence and trust in you, even in deep hypnosis. You know, people think hypnosis, and we've talked a little about this, is a state where suddenly you're a robot of some kind that just is under the control of someone else. This isn't true at all. People aren't under your control in hypnosis. That conscious mind is never shut down. And people will argue with me. No, you've misinterpreted this particular point. This is what I meant to say. So I think that in so many ways, the information and knowledge and wisdom that I've gained from my clients really was such a gift to me. I may have been designed to do this from the beginning, although I'm very humble about it. I really feel that I'm just basically a messenger, and that's it. But why I was chosen, I can't say. I think they made not the greatest choice that they could have made, but I accept it, and I'm very, very grateful.
Thank you. Michael, that's great. Everything you've said has been absolutely fascinating. What I'd like to do now is to move on to talk about the LBL itself and what actually happens. So the first question I have for you is, can you describe what happens in an LBL from a time the patient comes in the room to when they leave?
Okay, first of all, Alan, we call them clients, not patients, but that's quite all right. Some people think that they are patients, but they're really not. In any case, essentially what we do in the beginning is to take a biography, talk to them a little bit about what we do as therapists in a general way, and get them to know who we are and what we're about, and to learn about them. And one of the interesting things I think about what we do is we explain that we would like the client to bring a, quote, cast of characters with them. Now, what do I mean by that? A cast of characters is a sheet of paper that the client works on at home before they come to your office, which explains who are the important people in their life and why. We're not just talking about parents and siblings. We want to know about relationships, the important ones. Now, if Aunt Mabel didn't have much impact on that person's life, we don't need to have Aunt Mabel. But we want to know those folks who had an impression, made an impression, good or bad. And it doesn't need to be very long, just a few words about each person. And what we do with that sheet of paper is that once the session actually begins and we begin to get into the spirit world, we're going to find out if those people are in their soul groups and so forth. So, and how the volunteer process of all this took place with this very difficult person in your life. Do you think it's an accident? No. You're here to learn something from them and they from you. Now, after this, most therapists, they each has their own technique. You know, we train people, but we don't have a foundation in stone that they have to follow. So once they leave our classrooms, you know, they work on their own procedures, if I could put it that way, as to just how they're going to take clients into the spirit world. Now, essentially after that, people do warm-up exercises in terms of deepening. We do a lot, and of course all hypnotherapists do this, but we have to do it very extensively. Body relaxation, getting into that place where you need to be in order to go as deep as we want you. One of the things that I stress very strongly is that as we progress through each hypnosis stage, once we place the client in hypnosis, the placing in hypnosis is very quick. It's the deepening that's my secret. And so as they go deeper, you need to check along the way. There's certain signs you need to look at to find out if they are with you. And if they're not, you need to back up and stop and work with deepening. Now, you might ask the question at this stage, are there clients who are incapable of going deep enough to do the work that they have to do? It happens. There are people who have difficulty with hypnosis. After some attempts at it, they may get around that point. There are other things that are, I don't think we need to get into, which involve personal blocking for all sorts of reasons, which the therapist needs to understand how to work with. Where is this coming from psychologically? Are there things they're not supposed to know? Or is it basically a mechanical thing, where they have some sort of a fear about going any further because they're not sure whether they can handle the information that they're going to be getting. And see, before my books were written, there was not as much of a problem with it. Now they know what they're getting into. So they're more aware of this, but most clients are just fine. We take them first into their childhood, their current childhood. All the time we deepen, and I take them down generally to, age 12, age 7, age 3, and eventually I will want to know about their very earliest memories. Now, part of what we do here is to teach facilitators that they need to talk about childhood things that are not traumatic, because that's not why they come to us. If they need that kind of therapy, they need to get it at home with a psychologist or psychiatrist or clinical social worker who will work with them on a regular basis. They're coming to you for information about their immortal life, not therapy. I find that very hard for some of our students to understand. Not that that can't happen, and if they're academically qualified to do that, fine. But I think it's more important to understand that they're coming to you to unlock their spiritual state. They want information. So in any case, what I stress with the childhood memories are happy memories that involve geographic locations, the geography even of their own houses, how to go from one room to another, what do we see in certain rooms, because I'm preparing them for the spirit world, because they're going to have to find their way around there in the beginning, and some get a little lost, but with your guidance and encouragement, they soon know where they are and where they're supposed to be going. So that's why we do a lot of that work in childhood. Now, from there I take them into the mother's womb. And I've trained all the people that work in our institute with understanding that the mother's womb is extremely important. I know that there's a school in metaphysics today that works with what they call womb trauma. That's not what we're doing here. It is when a client reaches their mother's womb that they first touch their soul state. Now you understand, the soul came into the mother's womb at a certain point and conjoined with the brain. People say, okay, well, what are the parameters of joining as far as the months? In all my thousands of cases, I find that souls join between the 4th and the 9th month. Not before the 4th month. There isn't enough brain to work with. Because when a soul joins a new brain, it is not like an alien entity, as some people have suggested. It is like a friend. The brain accepts the soul as kind of like a friend they've been waiting for who is going to help them. It's a very beautiful symbiotic, relationship. Now, what is interesting is that at this stage, we're first learning about the advancement of the soul. For instance, a soul that is able to work to help alleviate the fear of the mother of childhood is usually a more advanced soul. And you will ask those questions. If all you get from this soul at the time they're in their mother's womb, in terms of what they're able to do with the mother, is to say simply, I can hear my mother's heartbeat, and that's all you're hearing, it's dark in here, you know you're probably dealing with a younger soul. Souls typically work a lot with tracing the neurotransmitters of a brain. They work a lot with the chemistry of that particular body. It's an incredible thing. I mean, we don't know what a soul is, and anybody who says that they understand the soul as far as what is, to me, not being honest, because we truly don't know. What I tell people who ask this question of what is a soul and what is it about, I think of it as intelligent energy. Anything beyond that is pure speculation, but I think it would be fair to say that it is intelligent vibrational energy from just the outward manifestations of what a soul does when when it's in a pure state. But in any case, at this point, the soul is working very hard to conjoin with the brain. Now, to me, this is why the walk-in theory is so ridiculous. Because remember that once that conjoining takes place, it's very complex. That soul, that energy, and the human mind will begin to grow together into adulthood. Imagine that being torn away from a human body and a strange new entity, new energy, suddenly taking its place. I think it would lead to madness or suicide. I simply do not believe in the walk-in theory. Now, what happens then after that in the process of LBL is that we take people from their mother's womb into generally their most immediate past life. It doesn't have to be. It could be another past life, because after all, we can enter the spirit world from any former life, which is what they have done. We're now accessing the memories of what it was like in their most recent past life of crossing over, dying and crossing over, and what happens. And so what you have here is a soul who will describe a death scene. We will spend a few minutes with the past life, not an awful lot of time. We will eventually, pretty quickly, go to the death scene in the past life. From there we will cross over. And what we want to know at this point is who comes to meet you, what do you see, are you on the ceiling of the hospital room where you just died, or overlooking a body in the street that's just been hit by a car? You know, where are you? What are you doing in relation to your body? We find this out. Do you want to stay around for your funeral? Some people do, usually younger souls. Or do you just want to go? Most advanced souls will say, I just want to go home. And that's what the spirit world is to the soul. It is going home. Earth is not our home. It is a temporary classroom. It's a school. It's a difficult school. Earth is a very difficult school. There are worlds out there where souls will incarnate that have no divorces, no mortgages, and everyone eats seaweed. So there are beautiful places. I always get a kick out of this. I'm a little aside here, Alan. I always get a kick out of the soul who's a hybrid soul, who's been to another world, you know. And they've said, well, I've asked, well, why did you come to Earth? Well, I went to my guide and asked if I could have more of a challenge. And so I could just picture in my mind a guy doing this and saying, you want more of a challenge? I've got just the place for you. It's called Earth. So anyhow, we find out about those kinds of things. And so when a soul first meets their spirit guide, at some point in this early stage of crossing over, it is one of the most beautiful things for a therapist to watch in an office setting, because you're listening to a person describe not Jesus, not Buddha or Mohammed, even though originally they may say, oh, wait a minute, there's this powerful being coming towards me. I think it's Jesus, for example, if you're a Christian client. Well, I always respect, as I said, people's belief systems, so what I generally say is, that's fine. Let's get a little closer so we can tell more about this person or character or being that's coming towards you. And very quickly you'll hear, oh, it's not Jesus or Buddha or Mohammed or whatever. It's my immortal teacher. And it is a being who's been assigned to me and a small group of other souls throughout eternity. And they really break down. You've got to have a box of Kleenex close at hand. Because for many people, it is the first time in their life when they see a loving being who truly cares about them personally, who knows them like no one else can know them, and who in many cases watches over them. Now, I'd like to say, Alan, some people have very, very loving hands-on guides. My guide happens to allow me to fall into deep holes and I have to crawl out by myself. But it's wonderful to listen to stories of people. I mean, I've got a real Socratic guide. You know, self-discovery, that's the hallmark of the technique that being uses on me. But there's an awful lot of people who have truly loving guides who take them by the hand and help them through difficult points in their lives. But I just want to stress that regardless of the type of being who has been assigned to them as their guide, it is such a powerful moment that one can't help but be awed as a facilitator by the process of this person, if I could say that, who is your immortal teacher. So what happens usually after that is a kind of orientation where they go into seclusion with that guide, talk about what went right, what went wrong, how things might have been different. It's not too detailed at this point. It's kind of a once over lightly, how do you think you did? What could you have done maybe that would have been a little better? They're going to get much more of this later. So from there, they move into their spirit group, which is another exciting time for the client. This is why I asked for that sheet of the cast of characters. Because now we're going to find out, as they begin to approach this spiritual group, and I describe how that's done in my books, oh, I see so-and-so, and it's usually a very strange name like Amephis or Clodes or some strange name that you've never heard of. Well, who is this? Well, it's Bill. Well, who's Bill? My first love in high school. Or my husband or wife or whatever, if it's Judy instead of Bill. So oftentimes they use earthly names to describe these figures who have had an impact on their lives. Now, this too is a very poignant moment when they see these beings who were created with them, and their soul group was formed, okay? Could be anywhere from 15 to 25 souls. And now they're seeing each other all again after death. What I didn't say, I haven't mentioned yet, and it's kind of a complex subject, I won't spend a lot of time, but we don't bring all of our energy into any one body. A part of us always remains behind, which means if your mother died 30 years before you, you're still going to see her energy in the spirit world, even though she may have moved on into another incarnation, which I think is a beautiful thing. So nobody is ever really totally absent from their spirit group. So in any case, this too is a very fascinating time for you as a facilitator, because you get information on all the people in their soul group, how their incarnations in the client's current life has affected them, what are the psychological ramifications of that relationship with individuals, certain individuals, and what's the purpose. And so they all these recovered memories begin to pour out. And from there we have all sorts of interesting things that happen in the spirit world. People do different things. They have different types of classroom activities, if I could call it that, depending on their skills and abilities and their motivations and their experience as souls. And then from there, we will often go in front of what I call a council of elders, and they have many names, the sacred ones, the holy ones, the committee. There are all sorts of names, but I just hear the word elders so much, and the word council. Council is not the kind of thing that you would see in some Hollywood movies, like the one I always laugh about is Defending Your Life, where poor Albert Brooks was hauled towards judges in black robes to defend his previous life. Punishment being that he would have to reincarnate again instead of moving forward into a blissful life where he'd never have to come back to Earth. So this is the kind of, movie that Hollywood puts out about what life after death is like, and it's not like that at all. So from there, I talk to various clients about other activities that they may have in the spirit world, and eventually we come to the place of what I call life selection, which is where they decide, with the help of others, their guides and masters, on what kind of body would be most appropriate for their next life to do the kinds of karmic work that they need to do. And then, of course, the time when they embark again to return to Earth. So that's kind of an overview of the process of what a life between life session is like.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's really great. It's a very clear picture, I think. What would you say are the benefits of an LBL experience? Why do people want one?
Incredible benefits. People come for different reasons to see you. And it's interesting, you would think that they might want to know who their soulmate is, and they do, what their spirit guide is like. What's it like to really be a disembodied spirit? All these things. But always number one with most people, purpose. Why am I here? You got people that, for instance, a guy's shaving in the morning, he's looking in the mirror and he's saying to himself, and this happens, I think, for a lot of people, why am I me? I don't feel like this body is really me. I don't know why I feel that way. It's ridiculous. I'm here for one life and that's it. And I don't know why, but this is my body. I am who I am. And of course, what they don't realize, unless they've had an LBL, is there is a duality. One of the major benefits, Alan, of having this is not only learning the things we've talked about, but learning who you really are. By that I mean understanding your soul character, which is immortal, how it combines with a temporary brain, which involves, of course, all of the, how can I say, chemistry of the body, the chemistry of the mind, and then central nervous system, all that goes into making up a biological body, which produces one personality, the brain and the soul producing one personality in one lifetime. But that personality may not be the real you. It has a part of you in it, but all sorts of influences from the brain can kind of shift things a little to make it confusing for you, which is by design. We learn from every body. And so karma really is the sum of all of our bodies and what we've learned from each of them and what we've done that's right and what we've done that maybe isn't quite as good as it could be. So that's essentially the major benefit, I think, that comes out. Of course, a lot of other problems are understood once we understand who we really are and why we're here. So
just let's talk about this duality a little bit more, because this seems to me vital to grasp this concept. So, do you believe that there are a number of people on Earth who are experiencing a sort of a conflict, really, between their physical, biochemical self and their spiritual self?
I certainly do, Alan. Let's put it this way. We join a body. Generally, souls choose bodies for one of two reasons. Either the body is very similar to the character of the soul, in which case there's a kind of a melding of two like characters, if you will, or they choose in opposition. They either choose in conjunction or opposition. They choose in opposition. For example, you could have a low energy passive soul joining a very aggressive body in order to gain from that association. I find that more often than not, souls choose in opposition because they learn more. And when they do that, very oftentimes there's conflict. Internal conflict that even the conscious mind does not understand. This is why what we do is so powerful. I've had people who've come to me with 10 years working with a psychiatrist, for example, taking nothing away from psychiatry or psychology. And in one session, they find out the information they really need in order to help themselves therapeutically. So it's staggeringly important. I mean, I'm so grateful that you're doing this show, because if you can bring this information to people, that there truly is a way in which they can discover themselves and make themselves stronger for it, why not undergo the process in doing it? Now, you might ask this question. Well, if it is true that we come through with an amnesic block about our spiritual life, in other words, we just can't spontaneously recall all I've talked to you about, are we supposed to know this information? And if so, why are we given this amnesic block if in fact the information would help us? There's a number of answers to that question. First of all, the amnesic block is there but we have the capability of unlocking a lot of it. And if that's true, it's because by internally working on trying to solve these questions, we in fact intellectually grow as a human being. If it wasn't possible to access the information, we wouldn't be allowed to do it. Different people are capable of accessing certain kinds of information, and others are blocked. When there is a block, there's a reason. They're not supposed to know certain things because they haven't reached that fork in the road. That's why I never liked working with people under 30 years of age. And so I feel that it's important when we're a young person not to know all the mistakes we've made in our past life, because we might be doomed to repeat it in this life. We're given a fresh start with an amnesic block, so we don't remember all the bad stuff where we've made mistakes in our former life. And then we come to this question, well, but we are doing this now. People are learning about their past lives. And why is that happening? You might ask this question: would it have been possible a century ago to have made the discoveries you've made and to do what you've done? I don't know that it would have been possible. I only know that I feel very strongly that what we're doing now in the 21st century is different, because we are in a different world. The world, the earth, has never been so crowded as it is today. We have never had the population problems in past centuries as we have had today. We are like rats in a maze, and so many people do not know who they are. They haven't the remotest concept. And what makes it worse is that more than ever before in human history, we have populations that are on drugs. They're on mind-altering drugs. Alcohol's been around for a long, long time, but not the kind of drugs that we have today and the availability. And what does being on drugs do? It clouds the mind. It blocks the soul from developing. So I think those two factors alone are perhaps an indication why the powers that be upstairs, if you will, are maybe loosening some of the bonds of amnesia to permit this kind of work in order to make us stronger as a race and to deal with the problems that we've dealt with, that we have to deal with in this very, very complex world. Well, that's just my own personal feeling about it.
Okay, thank you. Can LBL cure addictions?
No, it can't. It doesn't, any more than going to an alcoholic treatment program, if we can just use alcohol as an example, because it's been around longer in terms of therapeutic centers. Addictions have to be cured from within. Certainly, we can help people in understanding why they came to the place that they've come, and they in turn explain to us how they've arrived at this place. They have to desperately want to break the stranglehold of either alcohol or drugs on their bodies in order to be able to progress in life. And I think by the time they seek out therapy of some sort, they have reached this decision. If they have not reached this decision, then no amount of persuasion will get them to take any sort of action. So no, we don't cure people. What we do is help them heal themselves by the knowledge that they have in their immortal memories.
Can anyone have an LBL, say hardened criminals or people diagnosed as mentally ill?
To a great extent, most people can, I think, access their immortal memories. There are some people who are very resistant to hypnosis, some very, very highly analytical people that might have a problem there, but there are ways around that. As far as the criminal mind, absolutely. We've had people come out of prisons who've had LBLs and have profited very much by it. However, if someone is very, very mentally ill, schizophrenic, for example, and their view of reality is very, very distorted as a result of this mental illness, I don't think they would make particularly good candidates for an LBL. We have enough trouble with those folks in traditional therapy because of their mental illness, and a lot of them are on drugs that will help, hopefully, them to learn to be more, should we say, into the traditional human picture of life and so forth. So in that sense, yes, if someone is on the mend. But I think a person who is in deep mental illness, is in the middle of it, is not a good candidate for an LBL. No, I don't believe so.
Okay. Can I ask you, what was your own LBL like?
My own LBL was very strange. Unusual question, Alan. Most people don't ask that. For years, remember, I worked alone. I was the only therapist. There was no way I could in here today. We require people to have past life experience. We feel it's important for their understanding, but in my day there was none of that. What I did, as you can imagine, is I began to look carefully at the students I was training to see if I could find a person who I was willing to. Now you can imagine my standards were terribly hard because I knew what I'd be in for. I found a lady who was extremely intuitive, one of my students. And these, as I say, are all working professionals. These are not beginners. And so she gave me my LBL, my first LBL. My wife, incidentally, worked with another one of my colleagues because husbands and wives, I don't believe, should work together on LBL for lots of good reasons. So my own LBL was very interesting. I don't know what I expected to find. I mean, I had no problems with past life recall or childhood memories that related directly to some of the things we've talked about. I was prevented, without going into too much detail here, from learning too much about my purpose on earth. They were all waving at me and surrounded by golden light and having a good time, but they would not let me across. I could see all sorts of things, but they just said, we think your work is going to be more effective if you don't know certain things about yourself. And so that's where we're going to leave it. It was kind of frustrating, but I think I understood really completely as to why the decision was made. I mean, I certainly saw my spirit guide and so forth, but there were a lot of things that I was prevented from seeing and doing, I think, for the very reason that I guess I was chosen to do this kind of work. What it is, I can't say, but it was a fascinating session.
That's very interesting. Does spirit speak to us through our dreams as well?
Yes, I think it's true that is the case. Remember, Alan, that every guide, every being who's in charge, and I put in charge, they don't look upon it kind of like in a classroom experience like we do, has a different approach to their, quote, student. Now, you can have guides who can enter into an existing dream and slightly alter it in order to transmit information. Or you can have guides that will create an entire new dream in order to impart that same information. Now, people say, well, does this mean that every time I dream there's a guide involved? No. We have a lot of crazy, insane dreams that I think don't mean a damn thing. I mean, people want to take every dream that we have and want to come into a marvelous interpretation of what it means. And I know there's a whole school of thought about dreams out there, and I hope I'm not insulting anyone. But I think a lot of it is just venting, and a lot of it is nonsense. We know when it isn't nonsense. We know when we're given messages about how we could help someone and this sort of thing. And a lot of it may come from our own intuitive nature. But I do think our guides can play a role in certain dreams when we're needed to know certain things, when we need to know about certain things.
Okay, that's great. Just to go back to couples, have you had this experience, and maybe with your own wife as well, when a couple have had separate LBLs, have they had similar or identical insights into knowing each other at the soul level, and maybe also in past lives? Did you find that in your own case with your own wife?
Well, my wife is my soulmate, and not only did I see it, but she saw it when she worked with one of my colleagues. Incidentally, she thought that my colleague was wonderful. She thought he was so gentle and non-directive, quite different than me. And so it was a good thing. I mean, wives and husbands are pretty sharp about such things when it comes to trying to pick the right person to help them. Yeah, we very definitely saw that. One interesting thing I thought came out of my wife's session was when we had our first child, I about went crazy down in the lobby of the hospital. I just, quote, knew that something could go wrong. Now, a lot of husbands are apprehensive about their first child, but I really was almost losing it down there, and my mother was down there at the time. This was at a hospital in Los Angeles, and she couldn't understand me. She thought I was somebody else. She said, "This is not like you," and I just really, and every time the doctor came downstairs, it was a long, difficult delivery, and so I just finally, when our little boy was born, I just collapsed. Well, Stephen, who worked with my wife, one of my colleagues, found out that I had lost her in her last life in childbirth. And I had spent an entire life grieving for her. It was terrible. We were both very young. So now I understand why, that internal memory, which I didn't know at the time, was kicking in that hospital lobby during the time of the birth of my first child.
Wow, that's an incredible story. Yes, have you ever had a client who has a very strong spiritual belief system and way of life, such as a Native American Indian or an Aboriginal, and has that affected their LBL experience in any way, or is it a natural harmony between the two?
Every client that comes to you has preconceptions. Whether they are an Native American Indian today, or whether they believe they were in a past life. That may or may be not true. Some people are right on the mark in what they believe has happened to them before in other lives, for example. Their spiritual memories are much different because this is kind of an ethereal thing that they may believe that they have seen their guide, and they might very well have. But they haven't really got a handle on it like a past life, a sudden spontaneous recall would give them about, for example, being killed in the Civil War, or being on the plains as an Indian in the last century. What I can tell you, Alan, is that regardless of the preconceptions, once you are in deep hypnosis, you cannot lie. I mean, you may want something to be true, but that doesn't mean it's going to be true. And I have a very graphic example. Every so often I would get a client who would come to me after having read my books. "Dr. Newton, you're going to find I'm a very old soul. I'm in my last incarnation. I'm a blue light." And very oftentimes, I'm always very gentle with such people. I would find that they are a rank beginner. They simply wanted it so bad because they have such a long distance to go. I mean, we all have a long way to go. But people's preconceptions, you might think would stand in the way of getting accurate information. But once you have them in deep hypnosis, no. I mean, it all comes out in the wash. I mean, and that's why you have to choose your facilitator so carefully. You have to find a very sensitive, gentle person, someone who is truly empathetic with what you're going through and will be understanding it. And you don't want someone that's going to say, "Well, no, that's obviously not true." You just don't do that. You're very gentle with people. You bring them out. You say, "Well, okay, if you're seeing thus and so, what does this tell you? And how would you interpret what you're seeing? How does this relate to what you've told me before?" These kinds of questions. That's how you get to the bottom of things. Okay. So preconceptions pretty much go out the window after you start. But once in a while they're accurate. Someone has had memory flashes, perhaps a dream, whatever. So I don't want to take away from that, Alan. That does happen.
Does religion and faith become superfluous after a powerful LBL?
I think, of course, I'm someone who feels very strongly about the damage that organized religion has done, especially fundamentalism, where dogma has so clouded a person's thinking that whatever anyone else thinks can't be right because it's not what I think. So much trouble going on now, for example, in the Middle East over the religious and national issues. And in the past, you can look back to the Middle Ages, the fear engendered, by many elements of Christianity, for example, and the Inquisition and torture and so forth of people. I feel religion has done a lot of damage, but I also feel it's done a lot of good because it's given people hope, and it's given them a true spiritual feeling about what life is all about. They're perhaps better people because of it. They're very kind and compassionate. They contribute to charities and so forth. So I'm not just issuing a blanket statement here about religion. It has all sorts of ramifications depending upon the person and upon the belief system that they've had. So in general, to answer your question, I think it would be best to say that for the typical person who is religious, they have a sense of spirituality and how they relate to it, and that can be very helpful in an LBL. It can be very helpful. Understanding there is a power beyond yourself. And someone who began as an atheist, as I did, with no belief system in any higher power, I can appreciate the value of this, that there is a power beyond you that has, and I don't want to use the word control, influence over your life and your surroundings. So, yeah, I think it can be of great benefit. But it can also be a detriment if it's carried to an extreme and makes you a rigid person. Oftentimes those people are very fearful themselves. They won't ever admit it. But some of the most fearful people that I have worked with about what's going to happen to them after death are extremely religious people. So, it's a balance. It takes a balance, really, of thinking.
Can we just talk about fear for a moment? What does fear do to us? You've already said, that there is so much fear in this world. What does fear do to us that is inimical to our spiritual development?
It cripples us. It makes us less than what we could be without it. Fear comes really in the very, very beginning. I mean, you look at a brand new baby and you think, isn't it wonderful that child does not have fear at this particular moment? But it doesn't take long, living on earth with a particular set of parents and circumstances, environmental, whatever, the kind of socialization that goes on in every culture, where children can become afraid for various reasons. They might be afraid of the dark, but quite often they're afraid of another child who is perhaps bullying them or whatever. Or the things that they don't understand just about nature, unless they have very kind, loving parents who lead them through this. But as time goes on, there are people who are more prone to be fearful than others for a variety of reasons. Maybe they have abnormal brain chemistry, whatever, but they become obsessive about their fears over certain things. Now, what I object to is when a belief system or dogma engenders fear if you don't follow a particular teaching, sacred book, you name it. To me, that puts fear on a massive scale. When you're dealing with an entire culture who is fearful because, for example, a very strict religious belief system, they can't do anything else. But you have fear in other areas where religion is not involved. You have tyrannical leaders in countries who are, they're dictators, they're tyrants, and they rule by fear. Saddam Hussein would be a good example, with mass killings and repression and so forth. And we've seen this all over the world. You have your Hitlers and your Stalins and your Mao Zedongs, who are people who ruled through fear. And, Hitler and Stalin and Mao were not particularly religious people, but they were political autocrats, and they ruled through fear. So fear comes from a lot of different areas in a person's life, depending on who they are, how they were raised, what country they live in, and so forth. But it is one of the most crippling aspects of human life.
But presumably this is one of the reasons for coming to planet Earth, is that this is one of the big tests. Absolutely. Can you still hear your soul through all that fear that's crippling.
Absolutely, because there are worlds where fear does not exist. This is so true, Alan. Now, people will say, for instance, I remember this scene so vividly. When they were showing the damage of 9/11, those planes crashing, into the Trade Center, and the buildings were falling, and there was fire and dust and coming up. And I remember this one film crew that got into this section in New York City where one of the buildings were, and this woman turned to the camera. She was all covered in soot and crying. She said, "Now I know that there is no God." And the person who was filming her said, because of it, absolutely, no loving God could permit this. Either there's no God or he is a very malevolent being. Now you see, this woman has allowed fear to totally, of what was going on around her, to totally cloud her thinking about the larger picture. The larger picture being, if you elect to come to Earth as an Earth school to work and train here to learn in a physical body, you have to accept certain things. You have to accept the autocrats. You have to accept the Hitlers of this world, the Saddam Husseins. You have to accept repression in other areas, such as some of the more fundamentalist religions that we've talked about. But also you have to accept earthquakes, tidal waves. You have to accept the geology of Earth that can bring natural disasters along with man-made disasters, which include fear. So you have to accept the whole enchilada when you come to Earth. And some people find that awfully hard because they have no belief system. They are just, quote, thrown here by the caprice of something or someone or nothing. They're just here by accident. And somehow they've got to endure all this with no purpose, really nothing more than the simple understanding for them that they have to survive to the time of their death. And they don't know why, but survival is all what it's all about. So that's Earth, Alan. That's the Earth School.
It's tough. So that leads me to my next question. Can people have more than one LBL sort of come back for a further development or a top-up, or, does this happen, or would you generally advise people just to prepare and come for one really deep focused LBL?
I truly think that one is enough. I've had people that have come back for second LBLs to refine certain bits of information that they didn't think they clarified enough. And I hear from my colleagues whom I've trained that sometimes a second LBL will bring other aspects of the spirit world out that weren't too clear in the first one. But typically, I find that most people get what they need in one session. During that 3 or 4 hours, all of their essential memories are unfolding about what life is like in the spirit world and who they are and why they decided to come. So yeah, I would say generally one would be enough.
Okay. Have you ever had a patient who described a former life in which they were not in a human form?
Yes. I've had clients who have talked about being on other worlds, and we've touched on it, but we haven't discussed it very much. I call these souls hybrid souls. These are souls who began their incarnation on other worlds, be they mental or a physical world. More often than not, it's a physical world. And that world has either gone into nova and been destroyed. All stars have a beginning, middle, and end. All planets surround stars. So this happens. But also for the reasons that I mentioned a little earlier, where a soul feels they need more of a challenge, or for whatever reason, particularly their guides may come to them and say, we think you need more work in a certain area, and this is not the world to do it. So there's many reasons why they come to Earth. Now let me just say a word about the hybrid soul. Typically, they may comprise 10-15% of your clientele, maybe a little more. It depends kind of on how many clients you're seeing and how long you've been around as a therapist. But the hybrid soul is an interesting soul. First of all, most of them are a little more advanced. They're not a rank beginner because they've been working on other worlds. And they have generally come because the things they've discovered on that other world that they feel need refinement that they could gain on Earth, they bring certain things with them. Now, I talk about a case of a lady, her name was Harriet, very highly advanced soul who didn't need to incarnate anymore. And she came because she heard me at a truck. She was a waitress at a truck stop in the middle of a desert town, crossroad towns where truckers would come through and maybe have a cup of coffee before driving on. And she would put her arm around them and talk to them, how's your life going, and so forth. Well, this woman was what I call a watcher. She was coming back to Earth to do some very advanced work, someone who didn't really need it herself. And she heard me on an all-night radio show one night. So she made an appointment, came to see me, and I didn't realize at the time, I thought she came up in this is talk about preconceptions. We talked about this a little earlier. Hair was all piled up in kind of a mess, and wearing a funny kind of house dress, and she jumps out of a pickup truck with flip-flops on. Hi, Doc. And so she comes in, and I think, well, we've got a rank beginner here. I soon found out this woman gave me a hug, and her energy lifted me off the ground, and I thought, oh my God. And come to find out, she's one of the most advanced souls I'd ever worked with. And she had actually come for me. But the point I'm making with the story is that she was a hybrid soul, and on her first world, her skills were honed in joining in a conscious state with the minds of fellow beings. And they often, quote, exchanged minds in order to understand more about that person and how they were perceiving everything around them. Very, very skillful mental telepaths. Now, you may think, well, this world must be far advanced from Earth. In many cases, you'll find that a hybrid world is may be more technologically advanced, but their brains aren't any more capable. They've just been around longer. Now, in the case of Harriet, she was using those skills that she had gained as a soul on this other world to help people here. So the hybrid soul is very interesting. And I will say this, though, on the downside, Alan, a lot of times a hybrid soul will come to Earth and just find this place too dense. The energy, everything about it is just simply too much for them. And they will check out early. They will commit suicide. And they have a hard time with their early lives. They may not want to come back. They may not be sent back. But if you can get over those early few lives as a hybrid on Earth, usually these are souls who do great work here.
Have you ever had a patient who in a past life recall has talked about living in a period of history that is just way, 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 way back in time, before recorded history?
Myself. I can easily answer that question. I was a caveman during the Paleolithic era, and I've had many clients who've had the same experience I had. Of course, being a rebellious person who's against authority, very oftentimes I was kicked out of the tribe and forced to fend on my own and just to leave the community. This was probably 50, 60,000 years ago. But yes, when you consider the length of time it takes for us to reach a stage where we're not incarnating anymore, it can take thousands and thousands of years. So yes, I've had many clients who existed during the Paleolithic and Neolithic eras. Now, of course, the younger souls haven't been around for perhaps only a few thousand years. So it kind of depends on when you jumped on the merry-go-round.
So can I ask you, have you ever had a patient from any of the so-called lost civilizations such as Atlantis or Lemuria?
I always laugh at that question because for two reasons. One, I've done a lot of interviews with Shirley MacLaine, and Shirley MacLaine loves to talk about her life on Atlantis. I suggested once to Shirley, I've never had her as a client, on a radio show that she might be having recalls from a hybrid on a world which was similar to how we have described Atlantis, a water world. And in the beginning, she was kind of resistant. I think I'm maybe turning her a little more towards my way of thinking, but I can't be positive, but at least she's thinking about it. Now, does this mean I don't believe in Atlantis? Well, as a historian, it can't be proved or disproved. I think it's interesting. I mean, after all, we have a situation here where Plato talked to someone who was had been to Egypt. In fact, Plato researched this a lot, where they claimed that there was a history of an island nation that was quite advanced, and maybe what we're talking about, something 10,000, 8,000 years ago, perhaps. So this was written down by Plato and called it Atlantis. A lot of people think that it was in the Atlantic Ocean around the Canary Islands. Others think it's in the Aegean Sea, perhaps where the island of Santorini is today. But quite oftentimes I find people that say in the middle of LBL, I'm in Atlantis. And I'll say, like I did when I talked about meeting Jesus, well, let's talk a little more about Atlantis and what does this look like, and what do you see around you in the way of ocean or water or whatever. And as we go further into it, I find that they're on another world, and that they carried that memory to Earth, and they assume that this memory was an Earth memory. Now, does this mean I think that Atlantis is an absolute false mythology? I don't know. Honestly, don't know. Nobody knows, really. We're still exploring the idea of an Atlantis. So I think the broader question here is it possible that some of our mythology and the symbolism that we have about certain things is basically grounded in truth, although we may not quite be able to perceive of the origins of that truth? In this case, perhaps Atlantis was really another world, a water world, where there were strange creatures that were intelligent and so forth. So I think this kind of symbolism, archetypes, if you will, if you want to use a Jungian psychology here, mythology, perhaps has its origins in experience, only maybe just not on Earth.
But this is just to summarize. This is my final question now. So there are many other planets, many other worlds. It seems to me that, nevertheless, planet Earth is unique. This is my instinct, my intuition about it. And is it unique because this offers the greatest challenges, but also the most incredible possibility of growth?
There's a lot to that question, Alan, and I don't even know that I'm qualified to answer it. Because after all, I like to play God once in a while, but I'm really not God, and so I don't know all the planets that are out there. I know that there are interdimensional worlds, mental worlds, as well as physical ones. Being an amateur astronomer, I know that there are billions of suns with planets. Is Earth unique? Well, it's unique because we're here. We're experiencing it. And there's a lot that I think unique about Earth when I hear about other worlds from hybrids. But every world is unique, and every world has its own special way of teaching the souls that go to it. They may not look like us. They may look like these strange mythological creatures we've been talking about. And that doesn't matter. I think the larger question here is, does a source place worlds where life can exist for a definite purpose? And I think yes. I think Earth is here, and all the other worlds and where there's life of any kind, I think, or intelligence of some sort, I think there's purpose to all of it. And whether we're more unique than another world is very subjective. So I think we have to look at the creator or the source to see if the entire cosmos isn't simply a child's building blocks for us as children to come and learn by a parent who's presenting opportunities to us.
Thank you very much. Let's.
And do you see snow here?
Yes, we do.
When in the winter?
Comes across the top, and this is the lower part of the Sierra. So in other words, what you're looking at, we're in the foothills, so you're seeing the first ridge of the high Sierras.
Right.
And then it goes on up to Lake Tahoe, and so.
And this is all your garden here?
Yeah,
Runs right down to
that's right. The apple trees.
It's beautiful.
And it goes down.
What a beautiful place.
We have almost an acre of ground here.
Well, shall we go in and
Yes,
do the
let's
interview?
do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.